All right, everybody. Welcome to the Business of Art podcast. Today, we are joined by Dustin Van Wechel out of Colorado. So glad to have him on the podcast. Okay, so to get started, I'm going to read off a little bit of Dustin's bio and some of the things that he's been involved in. In February of 2002, Dustin Van Wechel left a successful 8-year career in the advertising industry to pursue his lifelong passion, fine art, full-time. Since then, Dustin has earned numerous distinctions, including the 2018 People's Choice Award at the 2018 Buffalo Bill Art Show. In 2015 and 2022, he won the Bob Kuhn Award for Wildlife at the Masters of the American West Show. In 2015, he got the Premier Platinum Award at the Buffalo Bill Show. He received the Wildlife Award and Teton Lodge Company Award at the 2006 Arts for the Parks competition. He's also been featured in several leading art publications such as Art of the West, Western Art Collector Magazine, Southwest Art, Fine Art Connoisseur, The Artist Magazine, The Pastel Journal, and Drawing Magazine. His work has been exhibited all throughout the U.S. in one-man shows and major art exhibitions and museums, including the National Museum of Wildlife Art, the Autry Museum of the American West, the Buffalo Bill Historical Center, the Booth Museum, and the Briscoe Museum of Western Art, as well as the National Cowboy and Western Heritage Museum. So that's a pretty awesome resume there, Dustin. We're honored to have you.
Hey, I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much. So what I want you to do for our listeners to start us off is to take us through your journey from before, kind of like when you started to get your feet wet in the arts. Even tell us about like how young you were and kind of that whole journey up till now. We want to hear all the juicy details.
Sure. Well, it started as a fetus. I don't know no, I'm just kidding. I started my career in my late 20s. I had drawn and painted my entire life. Leading up to that point, I always had a sketch pad in my desk or locker and had it all the time with me and stuff. And so I was sort of an artist ever since I can remember, to be honest with you. I don't remember ever not drawing and painting. But in high school, I never had a sense, going into college, I never had a sense that you could make a living as an artist. I had always been told that, the myth of the starving artist. And so when I left high school, went to college, I got a degree in visual communications, essentially graphic design. And I went to work in the advertising industry. And I still had this drive. I was still constantly drawing and painting outside of work on my own. And I thought I would build a portfolio of work that I could shop around the galleries while I was working. And it turns out that, at least in advertising, and for me, most of my time was monopolized by my job. There were lots of times where I worked even 20-hour days. I'd sleep at the agency and then go right back to work. It was really quite brutal. And I discovered how much I disliked working in advertising, even working as a graphic designer. And so I eventually just kind of made a plan. How do I get out of this? How do I transition from this advertising industry into fine art? And so I went to a couple of shows. I talked to some artists and they told me how they had done it. And, I could see that it was possible. And so then I just found a sugar mama to pay my way in. Here we are. No, I'm kidding. My wife, she was on board as well. And so we decided to, after I'd saved up about a year's worth of expenses, because I did pretty well in advertising. I made a lot of money, especially at a young age, and I didn't have any expenses. I had no debt. It was easy to save money. And so that's what we did. We saved up a year of expenses. And then I quit my job. We moved to a small town in Nebraska from Phoenix, Arizona, where we knew our expenses would be low. And where I still had access to all the subject matter I wanted. It was easy to get to Colorado and Wyoming and Montana, and it was easy to get to shows, some of which were on the East Coast, some of which were on the West Coast. So it was a good centralized location to start my career. Mm-hmm. What was interesting about it was I found the local community in Nebraska in particular was incredibly supportive of what I was doing. I happened to find, through a mutual friend, a gallery in a small town adjacent to where we lived, only about 20,000 people, but it was just a a little gallery downtown, and she asked me, we're talking months after I quit my job and I was just getting started building a portfolio of work. And she said, well, why don't we do a show? Here, we'll give you 6 months and we'll do the show and they'll give you something to work for. And that's exactly what I did. So I produced about 18 paintings over the course of that 6 months. At the time, I was working exclusively in pastels. I wasn't actually an oil painter yet. And so I produced all these. Yeah. So I produced it. That was the reason why I was capable of doing it. Pastels were a much faster medium than oil paints are in terms of producing the quality of work I wanted. So I do this show in August of, I guess it would have been I did 18 paintings and probably, I think I sold 16 of the 18 paintings, which blew my mind because it's just a small town, really. But the show was packed. There were people came from Omaha, major cities in Nebraska to see. I had no idea, or I had no expectation at all of this. I just thought, well, I'll do this show. I have deadlines. It'll give me something to work for. And then I can start using that work to shop around to bigger, more important galleries and maybe hopefully get represented by one of them. But I ended up selling most of the work. And so, yeah.
So what was your subject matter at that point? Was it wildlife that early on?
It was, yeah. And I knew very early that I wanted to focus on wildlife as a subject. Even before I left my job as a designer, I was doing mostly wildlife art. As an artist, I like painting most anything, but it's definitely wildlife that gets me most excited to paint. And so that was really where I put my focus. Originally, due to the limitations of starting out as a wildlife artist, and I'm sure we'll get into this a little later, can be heavily limited by the amount of reference you have. And so most of the work that I was producing wasn't the kind of focus I have now in my work in terms of a Western subject matter, doing these much more complex paintings with lots of organization and elements and lots of subjects in the piece. It used to be very what I would call kind of sort of figurative wildlife art, right? It was just either portraits or just the animal standing kind of a thing, but it was all I had access to in terms of my own reference. So I used the pastel as a medium to sort of make those paintings a little more interesting, whereas, I didn't have access to really interesting reference material yet, but it worked out. And that funded my next year of painting. And during that next year of painting, I was applying to lots of shows around the country. At the time, there were a lot more wildlife shows going on in the country that artists had access to. And so I got into a few of those, and that's just how it went. And I plugged along that way for about a decade. It was difficult. I made a lot of sacrifices. I did a lot of travel. I went from making six figures in a good year would have been $35,000 selling my work over the course of that 10 years. It was enough to keep going because I didn't have any debt. Like I said, I didn't have really any expenses. My wife and I, we don't have children, so I didn't have any serious responsibilities. And so it was easier in that way. I put myself in a position where making a lot of money wasn't necessarily required. And I could really focus on the work and focus on getting better and getting into shows that I thought were important. And so that's what I did. It went on for about a decade. And then
that's awesome.
I got into a major Western gallery, sort of on a whim. It's strange. Looking back, you can see how it all worked out. But at the time, I didn't really understand how that had all come together. But this gallery decided to do a summer. It was Trailside Gallery, in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And they had seen the Western Vision show and decided they wanted to do a summer miniature show at their gallery. And so they were going to invite a few guest artists. And I was one of them. They had seen my work at the museum. I sent them 2 pieces for the miniature show. And it was within 30 minutes. I got a call from the gallery director asking to see more of my work. And if I could bring it, and they would think about representing me. I had 1 painting available. I brought it. They liked it, hung it. It sold within a few days, and the rest is sort of history. Yeah.
Wow. That's incredible. That's so cool. What a great story. So one of the questions that I have is kind of going through that experience. How important was it, do you feel, to have that monetary cushion where you didn't have the need to make a living immediately because you had saved up, you kind of had that freedom to fail? How important was that to you? And what would you say as far as other artists who are trying to get started? Like, would you recommend something like that?
Yeah, I think there's a number of ways to attack moving from what you might consider your soul sucking day job into being an actual artist and doing literally what you love.
Yeah.
And trying to make a living at it. It's not easy. It does require a lot of sacrifice. There are huge ups and downs. And I've always felt like, especially when you're starting out, in particular with wildlife art, you can be very limited in the ideas you're capable of accomplishing via your reference. But over time, you're spending more time outdoors. You're getting more of what you need, gathering more of what you need in terms of reference. You're doing more shows, and you're sort of on this interesting trajectory when you're talking, like if you were to plot it on a graph, where you're getting better in your work. Your work is getting more interesting as an artist as you grow as an artist. And at the same time, more and more people are seeing your work, and eventually those two converge. And that's, I think, a point at which you realize that, okay, now I have the financial success I needed in order to transition to full time or to feel comfortable, as an artist, financially, that you're not always just hoping that next painting sells because you need gas money to get return home from the show, kind of a thing. For me, I have always tried, and this is something just from a business standpoint, I always try to maintain at least a year of expenses in cash available to me in the bank.
Yeah.
I was able to start out doing that by having that savings, that buffer. And it's been relatively easy to do over this course of time because anytime I see that I'm starting to eat into that sort of reserve, I just make cuts elsewhere. I try to save wherever possible, And so I keep that buffer just in case things really slow down. I know that if the worst case scenario happened and I didn't sell a painting for a year, I would probably still be okay financially. Now, at the end of that year, I hope I've corrected whatever issues were going on. But that's what I try to do at this point in my career. Like I said, I didn't have debt and student loans, and I can't stress how important that is in terms of your financial success as an artist, because especially starting out, it can be very difficult, and you don't want the burden of those kinds of things looming over you the whole time you're trying to make it work.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. So how many years now have you been a full-time painter?
Yeah, since February 2002. So it's been a little over 22 years.
That's exciting. That's incredible.
Yeah. Don't mind. That's ridiculous.
So looking back on those 22 years, pastels, let's talk about in terms of your work, how has it developed? How has it transitioned? Tell us a little bit about that progression.
Yeah. So I started in pastels predominantly because I didn't have a strong background in painting. I had some basic painting courses in college as part of my degree, but I never really focused on it, and drawing kind of was my thing. Color in a lot of ways frightened me. And so I had started painting a little bit before I transitioned to full-time artist, but it was a meeting I had at a show with another artist by the name of Terry Donahue, whose career is focused predominantly in pastels. And he's a wildlife artist as well. And I loved his work when I first saw it. I thought it was brilliant. I loved the looseness of it, the quality of the pastels. And so I really talked to him about it. And he pointed out that, if your ultimate goal is to be a painter, pastels are a wonderful transition medium, right? Because they incorporate both what you love about drawing, but their visual qualities can very much invoke that of what a paint might do, a liquid medium might do. And so that was how I started with it. And I found I took to it really quickly. I found them really easy to work with. And I worked in pastels probably about 7 or 8 years, almost exclusively. And I got very good at them. And I got very bored with them very quickly. And it was why I transitioned to oils. Setting aside the reality of the economics of oil painting, and that is that there is just a higher perceived value set on oils within the market than there is in, say, something like pastels.
Yeah.
They were a medium that I just got bored with because I found them not so challenging But by the time I decided to move on to oils, but even to this day with oils, I often feel like I don't know what I'm doing still. And that's part of why I do it. I love the challenge of oils. I think a lot of artists are this way. And I think a lot of artists should be this way. They should be in love with the process of creation, the process of painting or sculpting, whatever that is for them. The end result is in a lot of ways irrelevant to me. I love the process because I typically end up disliking where it lands, right? Like we're all kind of super critical about our own work. I always feel like we're in this.
I understand that.
Yeah, I feel like we're in this sort of three phases of an artist at all times, right? We're good enough to see the mistakes in our work and fix them. We're also good enough to see the mistakes in our work, but not good enough to fix them. And then we're in the worst possible state at the same time as we're not even good enough to see the mistakes in our work yet. But it's except through, years and more years of learning and practicing and painting that we finally are able to see some of these things that we couldn't see now. And so pastels didn't feel that way with me anymore, but oils still always do. So I always feel like there's this carrot sort of dangling in front of me that I'll never really reach with oil paints. And it's part of why I love that medium so much.
That's awesome. I've seen a lot of your work and I've been fortunate to see it in person. And I've never thought, wow, Dustin doesn't know what he's doing. I feel like you're pretty adept at painting, but I totally understand the aspect of the challenge of it. And there's so many different nuances, especially I think with like texture and the buildup of layers that would be hard to get with like a pastel or another kind of media, dry media. So,
yeah,
you talked about kind of those different phases of where artists are at. And I think we all kind of go through that as far as being able to see what's wrong with our piece and being able to correct it. What has helped you to develop that critical eye and to be able to see when something is off or wrong and then to have the courage to fix it?
Yeah, I think I could definitely speak to what's unique about wildlife art. I mean, there are obviously things that are just sort of general across being a painter, period. But in terms of wildlife art specifically, it's difficult to stress how important it is to paint from life as much as possible, right? Like whether you're doing some plein air work or whether you're just painting your children, your wife sitting down watching a movie, whatever the case may be, doing that, I can't communicate enough how important that was to helping me see things and make corrections, particularly with perspective and atmospheric perspective and those kinds of things. Those are really important to helping me get better very quickly. I do teach quite often, and there's something about teaching that if you're a student, I believe in talent, right? Like everybody might excel at something more than somebody else just naturally, right? Sports is a great example. And that happens in art, obviously, but the amount of work you put into it and how dedicated you are, or how passionate you are, how passionate you are about painting or sculpting, whatever it is, I think plays a much bigger role in the quality of your work and how good you will be capable of getting. So as a student, you can try and puzzle through mistakes or problems that might take you years to get through. But if you have a good instructor or a good teacher, they can help you get through something like that in just hours. And so that has helped a lot. Like I do a lot of reading. I look at a lot of other artists' work to study how they handle things, whether it's aspects of their work that I would love to bring into my own, or whether it's I can see that they've solved problems that I've not been able to. And you can sort of puzzle through it when you look at their work or even talking to them. Because most artists I come into contact with are very generous about their process and how they approach their work. And so that's always, but really the biggest thing for me was painting from life. And unfortunately, I don't get to do it as often as I used to, but it really, really accelerated my progress. And I think that would be true for anybody.
That's some really great insight. So as far as what kind of, it sounds like you've done plein air. It sounds like you've even painted your wife or other things like in your house, like just get out and, get the paints out and set up wherever and just paint.
Absolutely. Yeah. When I'm painting like in plein air, I'm never concerned with subject. I'm not a plein air painter. I'm not concerned with creating pieces that are sellable. for the most part now, if I do it, I'm doing it for reference, right? I'm going, oh, I like those logs. I want to bring those back into the studio, and I'll be able to capture things that the camera can't. So I'll take care of that, and I'll bring it in the studio, combine it with photographic reference, and I'll have a better sort of end result in the studio painting by doing it that way. But I've done all kinds of crazy things, like, creepily painting my neighbor's house outside just because I just had some extra time, and it was a good opportunity to see how light falls on a faceted object. I approach it that way.
Yeah. So it's purely educational at that point. And also an investment into maybe some future material that you would have to work with into another painting, basically.
For sure.
Okay. That's cool. So it sounds like you're able to keep your passion alive by it sounds like you really enjoy the process of painting. Do you ever feel like it's a job? Kind of like going to the advertising agency and you're like, oh, I have to go to the studio and paint today and I don't really want to. Do you ever have days like that?
Oh yeah. Let me tell you a little secret. Sometimes it sucks, right? Like when you're being crushed under deadlines, and I try to pride myself on keeping a fairly tight control over my commitments. But thankfully I learned early on the value of saying no to things. But a lot of times I still overcommit, and I end up working countless hours in the studio, late nights, 7 days a week for literally months on end. And those are definitely the times where the act of it is way less enjoyable. You talk about keeping the passion alive for doing it. For me, that has always been getting outdoors, right? Like I paint wildlife for no other reason other than I like animals, one, but two, it gets me outdoors. I get to travel and see amazing places. My favorite places in the world, are mountains. And so I get to go out and do that. And no matter how long I've spent in the studio, the moment I get out and sort of immerse myself back into the quiet of nature, I very quickly feel the draw to get back in the studio. And I think that's the spark really that keeps it going. Even when I've spent months preparing for a show, for example, where I've just worked countless hours and, I'm just doing everything I can to stall going into the studio in the mornings. Sometimes it's a slog, but in a lot of ways, I feel like that's the difference between a successful artist and just a hobbyist, for example, is that discipline to be able to sit down behind the easel and focus on creating, even though every fiber of your being is screaming that I'm just tired of this. I'm done. I can't sit here anymore. That discipline is important to being a professional artist.
Yeah, that's some really great insight. And I would agree. I think that, going from a hobby where it's like I paint when I'm inspired to, and when I have that, it's almost therapeutic at that point. It's like I'm in my zone and I'm losing track of time and just getting lost in this work. And I still have moments like that as a professional, and I'm sure you do too.
Absolutely.
You've got that really exciting subject, or you've got some awesome reference that you're ready to work with. But then there's those days when it's a job and you're like, I have to get this done. And if I don't, I'm going to fail. And I've got these deadlines looming over me. And no, it becomes a reality that, you just have to take it as it comes. And sometimes it's not very fun, but you just work through it. No, I think that's very realistic, and that's good for people to hear.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And the reality is that as an artist, your success can significantly depend on your reliability as an artist, right? Your ability to meet the commitments you've agreed to. I don't want to be that flaky artist who's like, hey, I'm going to give you the gallery 12 paintings for this show, and I show up with 4. I want to be an artist who's meeting my commitments. As you say, that means just powering through that lack of inspiration that you can have when you're working that hard.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about your process. Like if you guys who are listening haven't seen Dustin's work, typically, at least from my perspective, you've always got these really incredible scenes with multiple animals in a really interesting environment. Sometimes you've got some really dramatic clouds and skies and just lots of drama, lots of fun angles and energy. And so, I look at that and I think, wow, you're your composition is just phenomenal. And so kind of take us through how you come up with a painting, how that all kind of works together, just that whole process from beginning to end. And let's geek out a little bit. We want to hear some of the good stuff.
Yeah, I'll be super specific with you guys. So I am in love with the narrative quality of painting, right? And so I try to tackle all of my work from that perspective, that I want to tell some kind of story, whatever that may be. And it's almost always a sort of romanticized version of things that I've seen or experienced, or even things that I would really love to have seen happen. And so I'm thinking about that when I start the creative process. Right out of the gate, I immediately decide, is this going to be a wildlife painting with some landscape in it? Or is it going to be a landscape painting with a little bit of wildlife in it? I think being on the fence in any regard, whether it's your color usage, your value structure, your design, or even the narrative quality of the story, not having a very strong decision being made in those areas leads to a less interesting painting. And so I kind of start there. It always begins with rough sketches. I'm not the artist who goes out, gets a lot of photographic reference, comes home, and then just flips through reference looking for inspiration. That doesn't interest me even a little bit. That's not to say occasionally I've taken a photo where a pose is really great and inspiration sort of springs from that. But I don't start that way. I generally start with an idea, and it starts with thumbnail sketches. I sit down, I'll do 20, 30, sometimes 50, very rough thumbnail sketches. Most people couldn't even tell what they were looking at. They're just for me. They're just shapes and darks and lights. They're about getting structure. They're about how I want to tell this story, whatever that is. And so I sit there and I'll do that over and over and over. It's sort of an intellectual exercise in order to arrive at a place where it's, particularly if I'm planning a very large painting, that's going to require a lot of commitment in time and a lot of commitment in energy. I really want problems to be solved right out of the gate. I don't want to have to be trying to solve them on the canvas. And so it starts with a sketch. And once I've settled on a sketch, I have a pretty strong memory visually for what I have in terms of reference. That doesn't come from any special ability, cognitively. I'm looking at my reference all the time. And so my memory is constantly being refreshed about what I have. My reference is all organized by trip. So it'll say, summer, Yellowstone, 2010. I'll remember, I took some photographs of some rocks in morning light during that time that I think might work for this idea. And so what I'm doing is I'm going to that reference and I'm using it in its truest sense. I am picking pieces of this puzzle that I want to put together, and I'm doing it based on the sketch. I know I'm going to need an animal with this pose. And if I don't have an animal with that pose, I will construct an animal with that pose. I'll go, I'm going to use that leg. I'm going to use that head, sort of Frankensteining them together. And I'll do that one of two ways.
I'm assuming.
Yeah. So that's definitely now how I do it. It's just faster. And, whereas say 15 years ago, constructing one of these more complex paintings might have taken literally a week to puzzle everything out through drawings, I might be able to do it in an afternoon using Photoshop. And that's how I do it now. So I'll just clip out rocks and the animals and pieces of the animals, and I'll put everything together. And what happens is because I have painted outdoors a lot and I have observed these animals a lot in person, I have an intuitive sense of how scale works, what things should be what size in relationship to their perspective and their depth, things that can often be deleted by the camera. As wildlife artists, you tend to use telephoto lenses. And when you're using a telephoto lens, it flattens the scene out, distorts relationships of scale. And so because of all of that history, all of that work I've put in as an artist, I have a pretty strong sense of how that looks. Not to say I don't always get it right. I get it wrong occasionally, and it has to be pointed out to me because it's a little bit like trying to proofread your own writing, right? Like you don't see those errors, and then somebody goes, "Hey, that looks weird." You go, "Oh, yeah, that does look weird. I made a mistake there." And that happens occasionally, but I'm not emotionally attached to the work, so I don't mind criticism, especially constructive criticism. But that's how I build a painting. And once I have that, Photoshop sketch put together, I then move on to drawing it onto the canvas. all of the problems have been solved. And so now it's just an act of painting, is really all it is. And I don't have to concern myself anymore with design. I don't just concern myself with how intent I'm using color usage, that kind of stuff. I don't usually draw my paintings out with pencil. I draw them just with paint and a brush because I will make adjustments as I work. I might want to make changes as I work. And I've found that when something is really drawn out in a very detailed way with a pencil, that I tend to just get boxed in by that drawing and I won't be as free to make adjustments to it. Whereas when I've just loosely drawn it with the paint, I'm just essentially marking out the basic landmarks and everything and the basic shapes. And that painting process is just a process of moving from very generalized shapes and colors and values and just breaking those shapes down into smaller and smaller and smaller shapes as I work. And eventually you end up with a more detailed painting, as detailed as you like, depending on how much you break those shapes down. But the nice thing about having all of those really important problems, those fundamental problems solved before I put paint to canvas, is that I can focus on things like the textural qualities of the paint, the actual tactile qualities of the painted surface, and building up those textures and trying to create interesting brushwork. I can focus on all of those aspects of the painting when I don't have to really worry so much about color and things like that.
That's awesome.
That's how it goes.
That's really cool. It's really fascinating to hear the various approaches to paintings, and I appreciate you going through that with us.
Yeah, no problem.
So let's kind of shift gears a little bit here. As far as marketing your work, getting it in front of buyers, what are the avenues that you've taken, and what are some things that you've done that have helped you to expand your market with your work?
Right. Well, that's an interesting question because there's really almost never one thing, right? Like there are lots of different ways to tackle this, and I think they all work relatively well, or even in some ways equally. Having an advertising design background and having art directed everything from broadcast media like television commercials all the way to doing print media and web design and all that stuff, I was fortunate that I had a really strong background in marketing. And I think initially in my career, it helped keep me afloat, whereas just as an artist just starting out who doesn't have that background may struggle more. I probably struggled a little less because I understood things like, for example, when I had that very first show in Hastings, Nebraska, one of the things I did was I wrote press releases for my show and I sent it to every media outlet within 200 miles. And that's why people came from places like Omaha and Lincoln, Nebraska, and showed up in Grand Island and showed up at this small town, in central Nebraska to come see the show, is because I had done things like that. And I found that media is generally pretty open to publishing or doing these things, especially if you've done the work for them, right? Like writing a press release saying, hey, this is happening, and could you maybe put it in your calendar or say something about it? And so that works really well. Worked really well for me in the beginnings of my career. You could talk about how an artist might establish a brand for themselves. And I don't necessarily mean things as specific as a logo, but just, just a way in which everything tends to cohere together in terms of how they're promoting their work, right? Like their website has a very similar feel in terms of how they approach advertising their work through that specific medium as it would in social media. I generally treat social media almost exclusively for business. I don't really treat it for personal things like that. And I think it's a good idea as an artist, as a professional artist. It's just your audience, just leave them concerned with the work you're creating. Don't necessarily, unless you want to, I wouldn't recommend it, opening up your personal life to it. You never really know how successful you might be, and that might be an issue for you later. I know a number of really successful artists who probably wish they hadn't been promoting so much personal stuff via their social media or online. So there's that kind of way. But the truth is, there's a lot of stuff that you don't have control over that just might happen through sheer luck, or maybe not so much luck, but that happen over a long period of time, where you could look back and see all of the elements that built you to that point. But there were things that, it could have happened sooner or later. Like, for example, an important gallery discovering your work, You never know when that's going to happen. It tends to, I think, happen when you've reached a point in your work where the quality is there. And I think as an artist, we're poor judges of where that is. I don't necessarily know that we're good at figuring out when we reached a certain quality where we can say, oh, this belongs in, so-and-so gallery, and now it's time to maybe approach them. So I don't know. I was lucky. I was fortunate to have a gallery take notice of my work that was going to be very good at promoting my work, was going to be very good at making sure a certain group of collectors was seeing my work, that certain media outlets and museums were going to see my work. And they did a lot of that work for me, which was great because I could really focus on getting better. But that kind of thing does play a big role. And that's, sort of the nature of the game.
Yeah. So here's a hypothetical question. And I think this would be valuable, especially with your background. Let's say that there was some kind of an apocalypse in Colorado where you live.
Yeah.
And Dustin Van Wechel, as we know him, disappears, right? But you're not gone, but you can no longer be who you are, right? You've got to start over from ground zero right now, knowing what you know, but you have nothing else established. You have no gallery representation. Nobody knows your work. Nobody knows who you are. What are some things that you would do to try to get your career off the ground and get it to where it is now as fast as possible? What would you do?
Yeah, I don't know that I would change too much. I think that's a great question. Let's say I had just a regular job, right? And I was basically reset, starting from scratch, as you say. And let's say I didn't have savings where I could quit and go full time immediately and spend a year just getting better and trying to shop around my work. Let's say I had to really do it the hard way, right? I had to make a transition. I would do it in a couple of ways. The first thing I would do is I would have to try and muster the discipline to dedicate maybe 2 or 3 nights a week to painting in addition to my regular job, right? Like I'm going to have some work to start shopping around, to trying to get into shows with, to try and get into some galleries with. And that's just how it is. You're going to have to do that. And then what I would do is I would try to get into a couple of shows I knew were a good venue to start showing my work. So if I'm a wildlife artist, maybe I'm applying to the Southeastern Wildlife Expo, right? A very large group show, tens of thousands of people attend it, and it has a lot of really great wildlife art in it. And let's say I get into that show based on the 3 or 4 pieces that I was able to complete during the weekends and at nights in lieu of my day job. So that show is just a 3-day show. And so I know I'm going to take a week's vacation from my work and I'm going to do that show. And I'm not going to take a vacation. I'm actually just going to do that show. And I'm going to do that with other shows as well. I'm going to use all of my vacation time to just try to attend these shows and get my work out there. I'm going to write press releases every time anything interesting happens. If I win an award, I'm going to write a press release to various art publications to see if I can get mentioned in the magazines. I'm going to enter contests in various online art contests or contests in publications, International Artist Magazine or something like that. And I'm just going to keep doing that until, and you will get there, or I will get there, until I get to that point where I have to decide between my day job and going full time as an artist, because now I'm making just enough that I could justify it. But my time is such that now I have to make a decision, right? Like I have to decide, am I going to go like this hard full time and take the risk of the financial stability of losing a day job, losing my regular work. And eventually you'll get there that way. And that's probably how I would tackle it now if I had to do it a little differently than I did before.
How would you jumpstart your social media? What would you do there?
Oh, social media is a real trick. The first thing I would do probably is I would be super attractive. That helps quite a lot, right? Like it's amazing how many views things can get when the artist is very, very good looking. But if I don't have that, and I don't, here's how I'm going to do it. I'm going to start by producing a lot of videos. Algorithms in social media tend to favor videos. And so I'm going to be producing a lot of short form videos for whether it's for TikTok or Reels or YouTube. Most of those media and those social media outlets are now, their algorithms are heavily focused on promoting these kind of short form videos. And so I'm going to do a lot of that. I'm going to do And I'm going to try to do it in such a way as to get clicks, right? Like I'm going to be sensationalist about it. I'm going to put headlines in there that say things like, here's like 5 tricks that'll like really make your work better. I'm going to approach it from both an educational standpoint, and I'm going to approach it from both, oh, here's my work and isn't it amazing standpoint, right? And I'm going to promote it that way. And I'm going to do stuff all the time. I'm going to, make stories at least once a day. I'm going to post a minimum 3 times a week. And, as an artist, I think that's difficult to sort of wrap your head around that. If you were just starting out and you are producing work that's of a good quality, right? Like it is good work, but you just don't have an audience for it yet. You have to understand that in today's world, social media is profoundly important into getting an audience. It's also the easiest way to get an audience, so it has that benefit. But you essentially have to be a content creator as well as an artist. And so you introduce this element into your career as an artist that is essentially another full-time job in a lot of ways. That it's going to distract you from getting better at your work. It's going to distract you from producing more work, maybe even as much work as you should be producing. But it's sort of a necessity, particularly when you're first starting out, if you want to pull a larger audience. And so that's how I would do it. And I would do it across, all 3 or 4 major social media platforms. One of the things I've noticed that particularly Instagram likes to do is it loves to limit your exposure the moment you mention any kind of sales-oriented post. So, for example, if I post a painting and I say, oh, it's for Throwback Thursday, right? Here's a painting from 3 years ago, and I post that, it can get tens of thousands of views. Instagram will show it to tens of thousands of people, and it'll get a lot of interaction. But the moment I post something and say, oh, this piece is upcoming for sale at this next show, here's the show, here's a link, that kind of thing, it gets suppressed. Instagram will suppress it purposefully. And the reason though, and it might only, it might make it to 800 people, right? So when you look at the metrics, you'll see a post that has no sort of solicitation in the post whatsoever is getting shown to 40,000 people, and a post where there is a solicitation in it, it's getting shown to 1,000 people. You realize pretty quick what the intent there is. And the intent is to boost the post. Instagram wants a piece of that. And they want you to spend, however many dollars per clicks in order to get them to promote that post to more people. And so keep that in mind. Try to cleverly think of ways of getting around that, not using words that are easily flagged as a sales pitch, like the word sale or the word exhibition or show. Try to avoid those kinds of things. And I generally find that you'll get more exposure that way.
Something that I feel like I've noticed with social media is if I have any kind of text on an image, at least the leading image in Instagram, I see the same thing happen regardless of what the text is. It feels like if it's not a video or something like that, then it just doesn't have the same kind of reach as something that is really a photograph or image.
They definitely heavily favor video content for sure.
Yeah, it's pretty fast.
But like I said, as an artist, you have to become a content creator, especially starting out.
Yeah. So are you pretty well equipped as far as creating videos, and do you do much of that now? What would you recommend to somebody who is starting out? Like what kind of bare necessities would they need to kind of get that rolling?
Yeah. So the nice thing now is you don't need a lot, right? Like a lot of the tools you can use are free. Most people have a newer phone, so they have really great cameras now on them, and you can use those. If you have a laptop, a newer iPhone, and a USB-C cable, you're pretty much set. You can pretty much make anything you want, right? Like it's really pretty simple. And I'm assuming that when you're talking about somebody just starting out, you're talking about younger people, but that's not always the case, right? Like a lot of us have careers and we have families, and we don't transition into our art career until later in life, which, for me as an art lover is a little bit sad because, I want the world to be producing way more art so I can see way more art. It's a little selfish of me, but so when I think about somebody having to put off this drive, this sort of fulfilling creative endeavor for most of their life because for whatever reason, life has just taken them in a different track. They're not getting to it until later in life. That's a little bit of a bummer. And that translates usually into an absence of technological savvy. So if you're young, these things are easy for you, right? You've grown up with a lot of this technology. You're open to new technology. It's like learning a language, right? Like when you're younger, it's just easier to learn a language than when you're older. And so if you're older and you're just starting to foray into this stuff, it is more difficult. More difficult to retain information, and all of it's new. And it isn't always really easy, particularly if you don't have a background in it. But it is getting much simpler, and it is far simpler than it was when I started. For example, if I wanted to do a video, it was a much bigger deal. But now it's not. Like I said, you can just do it with a good quality smartphone and a USB cable in your laptop.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's true. I think it's taking less and less to do what people would do years and years ago, with the content, or not the content, but the quality of the technology in our pockets pretty much nowadays.
Yeah, absolutely. It's amazing, really.
Yeah. So let's talk about we've talked about some of the challenges you face, but maybe let's dive in a little bit on some of the things that have maybe like a roadblock that you've run into, or a challenge that you've maybe when you were, earlier on, keeping you from doing what you thought you were needing to do, or getting to where you wanted to go. Tell us about some of those things.
Yeah, I think especially when you're starting out, and if you're starting out, it's funny, like if you're starting out young, I think just by nature of being young, you always have there's this expectation that if you just do good work, you'll get there, and you'll get there pretty quickly. And that's not always the case. And then if you're older and you're starting out, there's this constant feeling of having to have it happen faster because you're running out of time, right? Like even now, I'm starting to feel that way a little bit as I get older, that there's so much I still want to do in terms of just painting and my progression as an artist, that I feel like I'm running out of time. Like there just won't be enough time to do it. But in terms of roadblocks, I think just life in general has sort of hit me with the biggest roadblocks, whether it's something as simple as a major medical expense that you're like, well, how am I going to afford that? And I haven't sold any work. So how do I pivot in order to make some money so I can pay that bill, or whatever the case may be? I've been fortunate, and I've never had any roadblocks that I've had to make a complete shift, right? Like I've never had to go back into graphic design. I've never said, oh, okay, well, I've run out of money and my work's not selling. And so now I have to try and find a job as a graphic designer or an art director or something like that, which at this point, if that were to happen, I'm pretty much unemployable, right? At this point. So I don't know how that would go, but in the past, it was always roadblocks like, how do I afford framing for this show? Framing is going to cost me $5 to put together for these paintings for this show. How do I do that? And how do I do that in a way where I'm just not driving myself deeper into debt? And the way I came out of a lot of those things was just by persevering, right? Having the discipline to just keep producing work, no matter what the situation was. If I had to sell $5,000 in artwork at a show in order to cover all of my expenses, I was going to try to engage as many people as possible at that show. I wasn't just going to sit there and be quiet about it and not talk to anybody. And honestly, I'm not a particularly social person, right? Like that's hard for me to do, to engage people, particularly about your work. Cause I think there's this weird balance that has to happen where you don't want to be a used car salesman for your work, right? Like you don't want to feel like you're selling your work. I don't think you have to approach it that way. I think you can approach it and just telling people about your work. And that's usually what they're interested in anyway, if they're interested. And so that's how it sells. But you have to be willing to engage people. You have to be willing to say, who you are and why you're painting what you're painting and that kind of thing. Art, in a lot of ways, and your success as an artist in a lot of ways is about relationships. There's always that component. We don't, as art lovers and collectors, and I collect artwork as well, it's not so much about the art. It's almost always about the artist. Most of us can name 1 or 2, maybe 3 paintings from our favorite artists, but we can name a whole list of our favorite artists. And so it's sort of always about the artist. And that's how collectors, I think, particularly when you get into an elite group of collectors, right? When you're starting to do museum shows and you're getting into these much higher prices in work, and you're getting exposure to people who are really dedicated to collecting. They really do care a lot about the artist, and they're curious about it. You know, a lot of these folks see us as the same way we might see our favorite sports figure or celebrity, right? They in a lot of ways see us as celebrities. And so just having a conversation with them goes a long way. And I found that that's usually how I've overcome at least the financial obstacles that are set in my path, is by getting in contact with people who liked my work, but who maybe only saw it once or twice a year. So maybe I'm sending them a personal email about some new stuff that I've got, not sending them the newsletter that I send to everybody. You know, I'm engaging them. Yeah. In most cases, these type of collectors do become your friends. And so you treat it like it's a friendship, right? Like I'm talking to them. I want to know about how things are going with their family and life. And at the end, I'm like, oh, here's, if you're wanting to see what I'm working on, here's some cool new stuff I thought you might enjoy looking at. You know, those are usually the ways I found most effective in overcoming the financial obstacles, and not just relying on your gallery sales, not just relying on a show and hoping, I hope I sell, you know, these 4 paintings because that's the only way I'm going to be able to make the next month's mortgage payment. You really have to engage those people who are interested in your work.
Yeah. Oh, that's some really great advice. I think that's helpful. I think our listeners are going to be really, really stoked on all of this information. So you had mentioned a press release, and I honestly, I don't think I've ever written or created a press release before. And so you kind of got that ball rolling in my brain, and I'm wondering, like, how do you approach a press release? What are some of the keys to doing that, and how do you approach that?
So press releases are super simple. There is nothing complex about it whatsoever. In most cases, you can go online and just download a press release template and just plug in your own information. And it's really, a press release is really just a sort of professional letter, fundamentally, right? And that letter is addressed to whoever is responsible for accepting and actually doing something with press releases. So you're sending it to maybe the editors of your favorite art publications, and getting their information is as simple as opening the cover and looking at the table of contents and looking at the email addresses and sending them an email press release, right? And I usually set it up so that it's an attachment. I don't put it in the email. I try to make it a little more formal. So it's usually like an attached PDF, but you basically just write it in a letter form, and it's hit with just factual information. This is, you know, I won this award. I have this show coming up. You can view my work at this. This is my social media, and that's it. It's really straightforward, very quick. Doesn't have to be really detailed or extensive. It can be pretty simple. And like I said, I would just recommend looking up press release templates and seeing how they're organized, and seeing how your information about whatever it is you want to promote fits into that. Yeah, it's really not hard at all.
That's really cool. Well, you totally just opened me up to a whole different idea of something that I've never really approached before. And I think that's going to be extremely valuable to those listening in. So I think we're going to kind of try to wrap it up here in the next few minutes. I want to ask you one more question. If you could go back and give yourself one little just gem of advice, like even 10, 15 years ago, you know, as an artist, what would that be? What would you do?
I'd give myself 2 pieces of advice. The first would be to never compare yourself to other artists. That'd be number 1. That is a soul-sucking, fruitless endeavor. We are not selling cars. You know, you're not, the reasons why people might like your work over somebody else's can be completely emotional and have nothing to do with the specific qualities of how technically good you are. Right. So comparing yourself to other artists is just a fruitless endeavor. Don't bother. Don't hit yourself over the head because so-and-so's you feel like is a better artist than you. Just do your own work. I would have told myself that. And that is incredibly important, I think, because I think to some degree, we all sort of have fragile egos that way. And it's easy to create a lot of self-doubt. And that limits your progress as an artist. I feel like you always want to be motivated to create work. And if you're deriving motivation by looking at other artists' work, going, oh, I love what they've done here. And I think that's really cool. And it'd be interesting to incorporate that into my work somehow in my own unique way. That's great. But looking at somebody else's work and saying, God, it's so much better. I don't know how I'll ever get there. Like, that's just doesn't help you in any way. So that would be the first piece of advice. The other piece of advice, and this is strictly from a business standpoint, is always live as an artist below your means. And for artists starting out, that can be, certainly was for me, could be a pretty low bar, right? Like there were some tough times early on for sure. But as you get better, as you get more exposure, you will have some level of financial success, and just understand that in the future, it might not always be that way. And so you should live just slightly below your means and keep very tight control over the pricing of your work. That's something that I really pride myself on. I don't raise my prices a lot. They get raised a little bit over time, the demand for my work and my commitments, etc. But they have very small incremental price adjustments that keeps my collectors who are interested in my work as an investment happy, but also don't skyrocket the prices of my work too early. I want to have a long painting career. I don't want to have to worry about destroying the market for my work because only a select few people can afford it anymore. I want young collectors to be able to afford my work. I want them to collect my work throughout their lives. And the best way to do that is through pricing control. So don't let galleries and don't let auctions or shows dictate the price of your work. Keep it tight, small adjustments over time. No, never big leaps, and you'll have a long career and you'll sell plenty of work.
I really appreciate hearing that. It is interesting. You hear, galleries and shows and things like that, and they will try to dictate what you should do. And like you need to be charging more for your work. And I feel like there's been times when I've fallen victim to that. Like, I get these big dollar signs in my eyes and like, wow, yeah, you're right. I should. And then all of a sudden you're pushing people out of your market. There's just, you're going to lose clients because you're out of their price range at that point. And so that makes a lot of sense. Yeah. So,
and the market that you do have will eventually have bought all the work that they need from you. So, yeah, it's better, I think, just to have a little tighter control of the pricing.
Yeah. Yeah, that's valuable. What's upcoming for you? What's next in the world of Dustin Van Wechel shows? Are you teaching any workshops? What do you got going on?
I'm going to go take a nap. No, I'm kidding. I'm going to, I have a workshop coming up, an online workshop with the Scottsdale Artist School, starting on May 2nd. And it's 3 hours each Thursday for 3 Thursdays. So pretty easy to digest, workshop. And then, I am currently working for a couple of, 3 shows. I have a one-man show at the Broadmoor Gallery here in Colorado Springs opening in September. And that's predominantly the work I'm producing. And then I have a couple other pieces I'm going to be working on for shows coming up in September as well at the Buffalo Bill Show, and Western Visions at the National Museum of Wildlife Art. And that's literally my schedule for the next 5 months.
Awesome. So if somebody is interested in taking that course through the Scottsdale Art School, is that still available or is it full?
Yeah.
If somebody's interested,
no, it's absolutely
they need to do.
The nice thing is because it's online, it doesn't actually have an attendee limit. Like they can have as many people as you want, and it's recorded. So even if you can't attend the actual live session, you can always view them afterwards when you do have the time. But you could go to scottsdaleartistschool.com and do a search for me, my name, or just look through their available workshops. And as long as you're signed up by May 2nd.
Awesome. That is so helpful. Anything else you want to throw out there to this audience of newbies and upcoming artists and aspiring artists? Any words of wisdom that you want to part with?
No, I just say my only advice is to go for it. So, and that's totally selfish advice. I just want to see more cool artwork. So please, if you're even considering going after an art career, please do, because I'll look forward to seeing it.
Yeah, the world needs more art. I don't think,
as far as I'm concerned, never enough. Yep.
Yeah. That's awesome. Thank you so much, Dustin, for being on the podcast and for giving us some really great, valuable information. I think it's going to be really helpful to a lot of people, including myself. You've given me some great ideas, and I hope that everybody has been been really taking note and have come away with some really great things to work on.
Thanks for having me. It's a good time.
Okay. All right. Well,
all right.
Until next time, we'll chat later.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you so much for listening to the Business of Art podcast. We would love to have you join us every week as we interview incredible artists and gain insights from their personal journeys to success. If this has been valuable to you, please subscribe and share it with your other artist friends. We'll see you in the next episode.